emergency?
Ma'am, I'm at. I can't find my baby. Yes, ma'am. She was outside playing, and I came out here after cooking dinner a little bit, and I'm looking for her, but I don't see her nowhere.
All right. How old is this baby?
She's 4.
All right. What was she wearing?
She has on pink Minnie Mouse pajamas, and she had me in pink beads.
Law enforcement has recovered the human remains of 4-year-old Javeayah Harris. Sheriff Sawyer says they were found in a body of water outside of Aiken County.
That a few human remains were recovered in an area known as Cedar Creek Reservoir, also known as Stumpy Pond in Fairfield County.
What you want to say about the baby?
Baby. A local reporter knocked on doors around Javeayah Harris's neighborhood expecting to hear one thing. Yeah, we saw her playing outside yesterday. Instead, he kept hearing the same answer. Again, and again, and again. People who lived only a few houses away were saying they hadn't seen the 4-year-old in weeks. One neighbor reportedly said it had been a month or more. Think about what that means. At that exact moment, helicopters were searching the woods. K-9 teams were tracking scent trails. The FBI was treating this as the disappearance of a child who might still be alive. But detectives were now hearing that the child everyone was desperately searching for may not have been seen by the neighborhood for an entire month. That single detail changed everything. Because if the neighbors were right, then the timeline given in the 911 call couldn't be true. And once investigators started pulling on that thread, the entire story began to unravel. Within days, both parents were arrested. Investigators alleged that Javeayah Harris had not disappeared on the night she was reported missing. They alleged she had already been dead for weeks. So tonight, we're not going to retell the background you've already heard. We're going to examine the evidence that made detectives stop searching for a missing child and start investigating a homicide, the neighborhood interviews, the timeline that collapsed, the statements that no longer matched, and the moment investigators realized they may have been looking for a little girl who was never missing at all. Before we begin, if you enjoy in-depth true crime documentaries built around verified evidence rather than rumors or speculation, make sure you're subscribed to Midnight True Crime. We cover the investigations, the evidence, and the courtroom developments that often get overlooked. Now, let's get into today's case. When the first emergency call came in, nothing about it immediately suggested detectives were dealing with anything other than every parent's worst nightmare. A mother reported that her 4-year-old daughter had vanished. According to the account she gave dispatchers, Javeayah Harris had been outside playing while dinner cooked inside the family's recently purchased home in Aiken County, South Carolina. It was an ordinary summer evening. Her bath had already been prepared. Dinner was almost ready. The only thing left was calling her daughter inside before dark. But when she stepped outside, Javeayah was gone. The details sounded painfully believable. She was described as wearing pink Minnie Mouse pajamas, her hair braided with pink beads. Her mother estimated she had only been out of sight for around 20 to 30 minutes. She explained that she had already searched the family's property, including the chicken coop where Javeayah often played and the wooded trail behind the house. Unable to find her, she called 911. To responding deputies, it looked exactly like the kind of emergency where every minute mattered. Children of Javeayah's age can travel surprising distances in a short amount of time. If she had wandered into nearby woods, approached a road, or encountered someone with criminal intent, delaying the search could have devastating consequences. Law enforcement responded accordingly. Roadblocks were established almost immediately. Deputies began canvassing nearby neighborhoods, knocking on doors and asking residents whether they had seen the little girl. Search teams entered wooded areas surrounding the property. As the hours passed without success, additional resources were requested. Soon the investigation expanded far beyond the local sheriff's office. The South Carolina Law Enforcement Division joined the operation. The FBI became involved. Specialized search teams were deployed. K-9 units worked through difficult terrain, while drones scanned areas that were impossible to cover efficiently on foot. Helicopters searched from above. Digital billboards displayed Javeayah's photograph alongside requests for information. Authorities also established a dedicated tip line, encouraging the public to submit surveillance footage, photographs, or anything that might help locate the missing child. The search quickly became one of the largest operations in the region. Searchers eventually covered thousands of acres. Temperatures climbed into the summer heat as officers, volunteers, and first responders continued looking for any sign that Javeayah might still be alive. Throughout the search, investigators repeatedly emphasized one goal: finding her quickly. Because statistically, the first hours after a young child's disappearance are often the most critical. The longer a child remains missing, the more complicated an investigation can become. Meanwhile, the community rallied around the family. Prayer vigils were organized. Volunteers offered food and water to search crews. Churches opened their doors to provide support for exhausted first responders. People who had never met Javeayah shared her photograph across social media, hoping someone somewhere would recognize her. Every new tip offered another possibility. Every reported sighting generated another lead. Every passing hour increased the urgency. But while the public focused on finding a missing little girl, investigators were doing something much broader. They weren't only searching forests, they were examining timelines, interviewing witnesses, reviewing surveillance footage, comparing statements, verifying details. Because experienced homicide investigators understand something that many people outside law enforcement never see. A missing persons investigation isn't only about locating the missing individual. It's also about determining whether the reported disappearance actually happened the way it was described. That process begins almost immediately. Detectives don't assume anyone is lying, but they also don't assume every statement is accurate. Instead, they verify. Every timeline, every witness, every movement, every phone call, every claim. During those first days, investigators continued collecting evidence while search teams remained focused on locating Javeayah. At that stage, there was no public indication that authorities believed the family had committed a crime. Press conferences focused on the ongoing search. Sheriff Marty Sawyer thanked the hundreds of people assisting with recovery efforts. Officials asked residents to continue checking their properties. Hope, although fading, still existed. But behind the scenes, the investigation had already begun moving in a very different direction. As detectives interviewed neighbors, family members, and people familiar with Javeayah's daily routine, small inconsistencies started appearing. None of them alone proved anything. In fact, many missing person investigations contain conflicting memories. Witnesses forget dates. People misremember times. Stress affects recall. That's normal. But investigators aren't looking for one inconsistency. They're looking for patterns. And in this case, a pattern was beginning to emerge. One question kept surfacing during interviews. When was the last time anyone outside the household had actually seen Javeayah Harris alive? At first, that question didn't attract much public attention, but it would soon become one of the most important questions in the entire investigation. Because if detectives were right, the timeline everyone believed, including the one that triggered one of South Carolina's largest child searches, was about to completely fall apart. In every missing child investigation, detectives begin with one basic objective: establish the timeline. Who saw the child? When were they last seen? Who can independently verify that information? Those questions may sound routine, but they often determine whether an investigation moves toward a rescue or toward a crime scene. At first, investigators worked from the timeline they had been given. According to the 911 call, Javeayah Harris had been outside playing while her mother prepared dinner inside the family's home. After roughly 20 to 30 minutes, she was gone. If that timeline was accurate, detectives needed to determine what happened during that short window. They reviewed surveillance cameras along nearby roads. They searched surrounding properties. They interviewed neighbors. They asked residents if they had noticed unfamiliar vehicles or suspicious activity. But as those interviews continued, investigators started hearing something they hadn't expected. Several neighbors struggled to remember seeing Javeayah recently. Not recently as in yesterday. Not recently as in last week. Recently at all. At first, detectives couldn't jump to conclusions. Human memory isn't perfect. People often confuse days with weeks. Children spend time indoors. Families travel. There are countless innocent explanations. So investigators didn't treat those comments as evidence. They treated them as something that needed to be verified. That distinction is important. Good investigations aren't built on assumptions. They're built on confirmation. As more interviews were conducted, a similar pattern reportedly continued to emerge. Residents living close to the family described not seeing Javeayah outside for an extended period. One statement became particularly significant. According to public reporting, one neighbor estimated it had been approximately a month since they had last seen the little girl. 1 month. If that estimate proved accurate, it completely contradicted the timeline that had launched the missing child investigation. Now, detectives had two competing possibilities. Either multiple neighbors were all mistaken, or the reported disappearance hadn't happened when authorities were told it had. That possibility changed everything. Investigators immediately expanded their focus beyond the search itself. Instead of asking only where Javeayah might have gone, they also began asking whether the reported timeline could be independently supported. Could anyone outside the household confirm seeing Javeayah on the day she was supposedly playing outside? Were there photographs, security cameras, witnesses, store employees, friends, relatives, anyone? Those questions became increasingly important because criminal investigations rarely rely on one source of information. Detectives compare every statement against physical evidence, against digital evidence, against witness accounts, against objective facts. If several independent pieces fail to align, investigators take notice. That appears to be exactly what happened here. While search teams continued combing thousands of acres, detectives quietly shifted more resources toward reconstructing Javeayah's final confirmed movements. The investigation was no longer focused solely on where she might be. It was becoming focused on when she had actually last been alive. That distinction would ultimately redefine the entire case. Few pieces of evidence receive more public attention than a 911 recording. People naturally listen for panic, emotion, pauses, word choice. But experienced investigators approach those recordings very differently. They aren't trying to determine whether someone sounds guilty. They're looking for information that can be tested. Every statement becomes a fact to verify. Every timeline becomes something to confirm. Every detail either survives scrutiny or it doesn't. When Javeayah's mother spoke with dispatchers, she provided numerous specific details. She explained that dinner was cooking. Bath water had already been prepared. Javeayah had asked to stay outside a little longer before coming inside for the evening. She described searching the family's property herself before calling for help. She mentioned checking the chicken coop where Javeayah often liked to play. She described walking into the woods behind the property. She also expressed concern about people who occasionally walked along a nearby path behind the house. To the dispatcher, the information sounded consistent with what many frightened parents might report during an emergency. The call immediately triggered an aggressive law enforcement response. But investigators don't stop after listening once. They listen repeatedly. Then they compare every statement against evidence collected afterward. Did dinner actually appear to have been cooking? Could the estimated timeline be verified? Did physical evidence support the account? Did witness statements match what was reported? Those comparisons often reveal whether a timeline holds together or begins falling apart. Importantly, investigators don't determine guilt based on how emotional someone sounds during an emergency call. People respond to trauma differently. Some cry, some remain calm, others become confused. Stress affects memory, speech, and behavior. That's why detectives focus on facts instead of emotion. The significance of the 911 call only became apparent after investigators began developing evidence that challenged the reported sequence of events. If detectives were correct, then the call wasn't simply reporting a missing child. It was reporting an event investigators would later allege had never happened. That possibility elevated the recording from an emergency response document to a central piece of evidence. Because if the reported disappearance itself wasn't real, every detail inside that phone call suddenly carried a very different meaning. For several days, the public believed investigators were searching for one answer. Where is Javeayah Harris? Behind closed doors, however, detectives were beginning to ask an entirely different question. Where had she been before anyone ever called 911? The distinction may seem subtle. It wasn't. As investigators gathered additional witness statements, reviewed evidence, and conducted interviews, confidence in the original timeline reportedly continued to weaken. Law enforcement has never publicly disclosed every investigative technique used during those critical days. That's common. Investigators often protect certain details while a criminal case remains active. What is publicly known, however, is that the investigation eventually moved far beyond a missing child search. Authorities later announced that evidence led them to believe Javeayah had actually died weeks before she was reported missing. That conclusion didn't emerge overnight. It was the result of investigators comparing witness accounts, reviewing evidence, testing timelines, and identifying contradictions they believed could no longer be explained as simple mistakes. Then came Independence Day, July 4th. Instead of providing another search update, Sheriff Marty Sawyer delivered news that stunned the community. Investigators no longer believed they were searching for a missing 4-year-old. They believed they were investigating her death. The announcement instantly changed the direction of the case. Search teams became recovery teams. Hope gave way to grief, and attention shifted from finding Javeayah alive to determining exactly what had happened inside the home before anyone ever dialed 911. For the public, it felt like the investigation had changed overnight. For detectives, the evidence had been pointing in that direction for days, and the most shocking developments were still to come. By the morning of July 4th, the atmosphere surrounding the investigation had changed dramatically. For days, law enforcement had spoken publicly about finding a missing child. Now, Sheriff Marty Sawyer stood before cameras to deliver an announcement that no one wanted to hear. He described it as one of the hardest moments of his nearly 4-decade law enforcement career. Investigators no longer believed they were searching for a little girl who might still be alive. Based on the evidence collected during the investigation, they believed Javeayah Harris was deceased. That statement alone stunned the community. But what came next was even more shocking. Sheriff Sawyer revealed that investigators believed Javeayah had actually been dead for at least a month before the 911 call was ever placed. Think about the significance of that statement. For several days, hundreds of law enforcement officers had searched thousands of acres. Helicopters flew overhead. K-9 teams followed scent trails. Volunteers walked through thick woods under intense summer heat. Neighbors searched their own properties. The FBI devoted specialized resources to the investigation. According to investigators, the child everyone was trying to rescue had allegedly already been dead long before any of those searches ever began. It completely changed how people viewed everything that had happened over the previous week. The missing child investigation had become a homicide investigation. Search operations shifted immediately. Instead of searching the woods behind the family's home for signs that Javeayah might still be alive, investigators were now attempting to recover her remains. The emotional impact on the community was immediate. Residents who had prayed for a miracle now had to process an entirely different reality. Search teams that had spent days hoping for a rescue were now working toward recovery. And while the public was still trying to understand what investigators had announced, authorities revealed another major development. Both of Javeayah's parents had been arrested. The arrest warrants provided the public with the first official explanation of what investigators believed had happened. It's important to remember what an arrest warrant represents. It is not a finding of guilt. It is a sworn legal document outlining the evidence investigators believe establishes probable cause for criminal charges. Those allegations must ultimately be proven in court. According to the warrants, investigators allege that Javeayah suffered severe injuries as a result of physical abuse. The documents further allege that medical treatment was never sought. Instead, investigators claimed those injuries ultimately resulted in her death. The warrants accused Michelle Herring of causing the fatal injuries through physical abuse. They also charged her with filing a false police report after allegedly reporting Javeayah as missing, despite investigators concluding that no abduction had occurred. The allegations against Javeayah Harris were different, but equally serious. Investigators alleged that he knew Javeayah had suffered severe injuries, understood the seriousness of her condition, and failed to seek medical attention. According to the warrants, investigators also believed he participated in concealing what had happened, instead of notifying authorities. Perhaps the most significant detail contained in both warrants involved the alleged confessions. According to investigators, statements provided during the investigation were corroborated by additional evidence collected throughout the case. Authorities did not publicly release every piece of supporting evidence, nor did they disclose every investigative technique used to verify those statements. That is common in active criminal cases. Investigators often withhold certain information to preserve the integrity of future court proceedings. Still, the warrants dramatically shifted public understanding of the case. Only days earlier, the focus had been finding a missing child. Now the discussion centered on criminal charges carrying the possibility of life imprisonment. For many people following the investigation, one question remained. If investigators believed Javeayah had died weeks earlier, why report her missing when they did? Authorities have not publicly answered every aspect of that question. What is clear is that investigators believe the reported disappearance did not reflect what actually occurred. That conclusion fundamentally changed the direction of the prosecution. After the arrests, investigators shifted their attention to one final objective: bringing Javeayah home. According to authorities, information obtained during the investigation led search teams away from Aiken County and toward a rural area near Stumpy Pond, close to the Fairfield and Chester County line. Unlike the earlier search, this operation wasn't focused on locating someone alive. It became a carefully coordinated recovery mission. The area was remote, roads were blocked, public access was restricted. Specialized dive teams entered the water. Boats searched areas identified by investigators. Drones surveyed the surrounding landscape from above. The South Carolina Department of Natural Resources assisted alongside multiple law enforcement agencies. The operation continued for hours, then days. Sheriff Sawyer later acknowledged the heartbreaking reality investigators were facing. Based on the evidence they had uncovered, authorities believed it was unlikely that all of Javeayah's remains would ever be recovered. It was a devastating statement. Every recovery operation involving a child is emotionally difficult. But this investigation had become especially painful because so many officers had initially believed they were searching for a child who still had a chance to survive. Now, they were searching to provide answers. Eventually, investigators confirmed that human remains connected to the case had been recovered. The discovery marked another tragic milestone. For Javeayah's loved ones, it ended any remaining hope. For prosecutors, it strengthened a case that had already taken a dramatic turn. But even with arrests made, even with recovery efforts underway, investigators still face the difficult task of presenting evidence that could withstand scrutiny inside a courtroom. Because public opinion is never enough. Only evidence determines the outcome of a criminal case. With both parents under arrest, the investigation was far from over. In many true crime cases, arrests create the impression that detectives have reached the finish line. In reality, they mark the beginning of an entirely different phase. Now investigators had to answer a question that every prosecutor eventually faces. Could they prove what they believed had happened? Making an arrest requires probable cause. Winning a conviction requires evidence that can withstand months, sometimes years of legal scrutiny. That meant every interview conducted during the investigation would be reviewed again. Every search warrant would be examined. Every photograph, forensic report, and witness statement would become part of a much larger case file. Detectives weren't building a case for television. They were building one for a courtroom. According to investigators, the evidence collected during the missing child investigation had gradually dismantled the original timeline. Witness interviews raised questions. Independent accounts failed to match the story authorities had initially been given. As those inconsistencies grew, detectives shifted from searching for a missing child to determining exactly when Javeayah had last been alive. That transition didn't happen because of one dramatic discovery. It happened because investigators continued verifying every claim instead of accepting it at face value. One statement led to another. One interview was compared against the next. Every timeline was tested, every inconsistency documented. By the time arrests were announced, investigators believed multiple pieces of evidence supported the same conclusion. But detectives still had another responsibility: recovering Javeayah. Following information developed during the investigation, law enforcement shifted its search to a rural area near Stumpy Pond, close to the Fairfield and Chester County line. This operation looked very different from the one the public had watched during the missing child search. The hope of finding a child alive had been replaced with the difficult task of recovering evidence. Multiple agencies worked together throughout the search. Boats moved slowly across the water. Dive teams searched beneath the surface. Drones surveyed surrounding areas from above. Investigators carefully documented everything they found. Recovery operations require extraordinary attention to detail. Every location must be photographed. Every item must be recorded. Every discovery has the potential to become evidence presented later in court. Sheriff Marty Sawyer acknowledged the emotional difficulty of the operation, explaining that investigators believed recovering every part of Javeayah's remains might not be possible. It was a heartbreaking reality. For investigators, however, every piece of evidence mattered, not only because it could help explain what happened, but because it could help establish the truth through forensic science rather than speculation. Eventually, authorities confirmed that human remains connected to the investigation had been recovered. While investigators did not publicly disclose every forensic detail, the discovery represented another significant step in the case. It gave detectives additional evidence to analyze. It gave prosecutors more information to present. And for those who had spent days searching for Javeayah, it brought a painful sense of finality. But even with arrests made and recovery efforts completed, the investigation still faced its greatest test. Everything detectives had spent days building would eventually have to be presented inside a courtroom, where every piece of evidence, every witness, and every conclusion would be challenged. Because in the criminal justice system, an investigation doesn't end with an arrest. It ends when the evidence is tested. Although the arrests marked a major milestone in the investigation, they did not mark the end of the case. In fact, from a legal standpoint, one of the most challenging phases was only beginning. Making an arrest requires investigators to establish probable cause. Securing a conviction requires something much higher. The prosecution must prove every element of the charges beyond a reasonable doubt. That burden never shifts. It remains with the prosecution throughout the trial. In the Javeayah Harris case, prosecutors will ultimately need to present evidence that not only explains what investigators believe happened, but also demonstrates how they reached those conclusions through reliable, admissible evidence. That evidence may include witness testimony, forensic findings, medical evidence, photographs, digital records, search warrant returns, and statements gathered during the investigation. Each piece must be carefully examined. Each witness may be cross-examined. Each conclusion will likely be challenged by the defense. That is exactly how the criminal justice system is designed to work. High-profile investigations often generate strong emotions, but courtrooms operate under a different standard than social media or public opinion. Jurors are instructed to consider only the evidence presented in court. They are not asked to decide what they think happened. They are asked to determine what the prosecution has proven. That distinction matters. Throughout this documentary, we've focused on what investigators have publicly alleged and what official court documents state, not on speculation or internet rumors. As this case moves through the legal system, additional evidence may become public through hearings, motions, and eventually trial testimony. Until then, some questions remain unanswered. Investigators have not publicly disclosed every forensic result. They have not released every interview conducted during the investigation, nor have they explained every step that led them from a missing child investigation to homicide charges. That is not unusual. Many of the most significant pieces of evidence are often introduced for the first time in court. When that happens, prosecutors will have the opportunity to explain how each piece fits into the broader investigation. The defense will have an equal opportunity to challenge that evidence, and ultimately, a jury, not the media, not investigators, and not the public, will decide the outcome. For investigators, however, the objective has remained the same from the very beginning. Follow the evidence, document every finding, present the facts, and allow the judicial process to determine the rest. Long after the search teams packed up their equipment and the news cameras left Aiken County, the impact of this investigation continued to be felt throughout the community. For many residents, this case wasn't just another headline. It involved a 4-year-old child whose disappearance had united neighbors, volunteers, churches, and complete strangers. People had spent days searching fields, wooded areas, and nearby properties, believing there was still hope. When investigators announced they believed Javeayah had died weeks before she was reported missing, that hope was replaced with disbelief. Many volunteers later spoke about the emotional weight of the search. Law enforcement officers who routinely investigate violent crimes acknowledge the difficulty of cases involving children. Search and rescue personnel often train for situations where there is still a possibility of saving a life. This case became something entirely different. It became an investigation into how a child could allegedly disappear from public view long before anyone realized she was missing. The community also gathered to honor Javeayah's memory. Vigils were held, candles were lit, flowers and stuffed animals were placed in tribute. For many people, these gatherings weren't about discussing the criminal investigation. They were about remembering a little girl whose life ended far too soon. Investigations can answer many questions. They can establish timelines, recover evidence, identify those responsible when crimes have been committed, but they cannot undo loss, nor can they erase the pain experienced by families, first responders, or communities affected by tragedy. The Javeayah Harris investigation also sparked broader conversations about child welfare and community awareness. Many people ask difficult questions. Could there have been warning signs? Should someone have recognized that something was wrong? Could intervention have changed the outcome? Those questions are natural after cases involving children. At the same time, they are often impossible to answer with certainty. Every investigation is unique. Every family situation is different. And hindsight frequently reveals concerns that were not obvious in real time. What this case clearly demonstrates is the importance of reporting credible concerns when a child's safety may be at risk. Investigators rely not only on physical evidence but also on information provided by teachers, neighbors, relatives, healthcare professionals, and members of the community. Sometimes a single verified observation becomes an important piece of a much larger investigation. That does not mean jumping to conclusions. It means recognizing that protecting children is a shared responsibility. The Javeayah Harris case began as what appeared to be a desperate search for a missing 4-year-old. Within days, investigators concluded they were investigating a homicide. That dramatic shift did not happen because of a single clue or one unexpected discovery. According to law enforcement, it happened because investigators systematically examined the evidence, tested the reported timeline, interviewed witnesses, and followed the facts wherever they led. It's a reminder that the most important work in a criminal investigation often happens far from television cameras, inside interview rooms, forensic laboratories, evidence lockers, court filings, search warrant affidavits. Those are the places where cases are built, not through speculation, not through viral rumors, but through careful, methodical investigation. As this case continues through the courts, many legal questions remain unresolved. Future hearings may reveal additional evidence. Witnesses will eventually testify. Experts may present forensic findings. The defense will have the opportunity to challenge the prosecution's case. Only after that process is complete can a final legal determination be made. Until then, it is important to distinguish between allegations and proven facts. The charges filed against both defendants are serious, but under the law they remain presumed innocent, unless and until proven guilty in court. That principle is fundamental to the justice system and applies in every criminal case, regardless of the allegations. For investigators, however, one mission has already been completed. They transformed what began as a missing child investigation into a case they believe explains what happened to Javeayah Harris. Whether that evidence ultimately results in convictions will be decided through the judicial process. For the community, the memory of Javeayah remains at the center of this case. Behind every search warrant, every press conference, every courtroom hearing, and every headline was a 4-year-old little girl whose life ended far too soon. Cases like this remind us why thorough investigations matter, why evidence matters, why due process matters, and why every child deserves to be protected. If you found this documentary informative, subscribe to Midnight True Crime and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. We cover the facts, follow the evidence, and bring you the latest developments in the cases that matter most. And before you go, we'd like to hear from you. What do you think is the biggest unanswered question in the Javeayah Harris investigation? Let us know in the comments below, and as always, please keep the discussion respectful. The headlines may fade, but the search for truth never ends. This is Midnight True Crime. We'll see you in the next investigation.